I was 23 that summer, the kind of age where you think the world's still waiting on you to figure it out. And I just walked away from a warehouse job in Knoxville that paid just enough to keep me angry. The foreman had docked my last check for attitude, and I figured 2 nights alone in Deep Appalachia would burn the bitterness out of me. I'd grown up hearing my granddaddy talk about the mountains like they were church quiet, solemn, full of lessons if you listened right. So I loaded my pack with the basics: a one-man tent, a tin of beans, a half bottle of Evan Williams, and the stubborn notion that solitude could fix anything. Asterisk. The logging road I followed hadn't seen a truck in years. Ferns crowded the ruts, and the only sign anyone had ever passed was the occasional blaze faded to ghost white on a chestnut oak. I hiked until the sun sat low and orange behind the ridges, then cut left into a hollow where the ground leveled out. That's where I found the fire ring 12 fist-sized stones arranged in a perfect circle, blackened on the inside but cold as creek water. No trash, no beer cans, no carved initials. Just the ring and the smell of wet earth. I told myself it was a good omen, a ready-made camp. I cleared a spot for the tent, gathered deadfall, and had a small fire crackling before full dark. Asterisk, Appalachian nights drop fast once the ridgeline swallows the light. 1 minute you've got a sky bruised purple, the next it's ink poured over everything. I sat on a log, boots to the flames, listening to the pop and hiss of pitch pockets bursting. The bourbon went down warm, and for a while the only sounds were the fire and my own breathing. Then the crickets quit, not one by one, the way they do when a hawk passes overhead, but all at once, like someone flipped a switch. The wind died with them. Even the flames seemed to shrink, licking lower, as if the air itself had thickened. Asterisk, I waited for the usual night chorus to pick back up tree frogs, a distant barred owl, anything. Nothing came. Only the smell changed. Wet leaves, sure, but under that a sharper note, metallic, like a penny left on a hot radiator. I stood, swept my flashlight across the tree line. The beam cut clean through the dark, but showed me nothing except trunks and shadows. I told myself it was altitude, or the bourbon, or both. I banked the fire, crawled into the tent, and zipped the door tight. Asterisk, sleep didn't come easy. The nylon walls glowed faint orange from the coals, and every small shift of my sleeping bag sounded loud as a snare drum. Around midnight, my watch said 12:07, the numbers green and accusing. I heard the first footstep. A soft compression of leaves, deliberate, maybe 30 feet out. Then another, same cadence, circling left. I sat up slow, heart already kicking. The steps kept coming, measured, unhurried, like someone pacing off a piece of land they meant to claim. I clicked the flashlight on, aimed it through the mesh window. The beam trembled in my grip, but found only pine trunks and the low sway of rhododendron. The footsteps never faltered. They passed behind the tent, close enough that I felt the ground take the weight. Asterisk, I held my breath until my ears rang. The steps stopped directly at my back. 1 second, 2. Then the whisper. It wasn't a word. Not really, just air shaped into a syllable, low and papery, the way wind moves through a cracked window. It wasn't my name, but it felt aimed at me all the same. I tasted iron at the back of my throat. The whisper came again, closer, brushing the nylon like a fingertip. I don't know how long I sat frozen, every muscle locked, waiting for a hand to press against the fabric, for the zipper to rasp open. It never did. Eventually, the night loosened its grip. A single cricket chirped somewhere far off, then another. I didn't sleep after that dawn arrived gray and reluctant, the kind of light that makes everything look bruised. I crawled out expecting chaos footprints, torn gear, something to prove I hadn't imagined it. The clearing was untouched. My pack sat where I'd left it, the bourbon bottle capped and upright. But the fire ring had changed. Every stone had been turned over, the blackened faces now staring inward at the dead ash. The arrangement was still perfect, but the shift felt deliberate, like a message written in a language I didn't speak. Asterisk, that's when I noticed the boot prints. They started at the tent door, my boots. Same Vibram lug pattern, and walked straight into the woods, heel toe, until the leaves swallowed them. I hadn't put my boots on once. I'd slept in my socks, same as always. The prints were fresh, the edges crisp, and they didn't come back. I stood there long enough for the mist to soak my shirt, trying to fit the night into some shape that made sense. A prank? Kids from a nearby holler? But there were no nearby hollers, not for miles, and the prints were mine. Asterisk, I broke camp fast, hands shaking while I stuffed the tent into its sack. The whiskey bottle I left on the log pavement. Apology, I don't know. I followed the logging road out, walking backward half the time to watch the clearing shrink behind me. The ridge was steep, and by the time I reached the truck, the sun was high enough to burn off the fog. I threw my pack in the bed and sat behind the wheel, keys cold in my palm. That's when the whisper started again. Asterisk, it rode the air through the open window, soft as thistle, threading between the engine noise and the birds. Same syllable, same breathy shape. I couldn't tell if it came from the trees or from inside my own head. I drove anyway, windows up, radio loud enough to rattle the dash. The whisper kept pace, rising and falling with the curves of the road. At one point I pulled over, killed the engine, and pressed my palms to my ears until they ached. Silence rushed in, thick and sudden. Then the syllable again, closer, like it had waited for the quiet. Asterisk, I made it home by dusk, showered until the water ran cold, and burned the clothes I'd worn. The whisper followed me into the apartment, into the hum of the refrigerator, into the space between heartbeats. Some nights it's louder, some nights it's only a suggestion. I looked up the sound once, typed every spelling I could think of into search bars. Nothing matched. I even drove back to the trailhead a month later, armed with a better flashlight and a friend who swore he'd keep watch. The fire ring was gone. Not dismantled gone. The ground smooth, pine needles raked neat, no scorch marks, no stones. My friend laughed it off, said I'd dreamed the whole thing. I didn't argue. I just listened to the woods and heard the syllable waiting. Asterisk, I don't camp anymore. I keep the apartment lights on low, the kind of glow that doesn't quite reach the corners. Every so often I catch the smell wet leaves and hot copper, and the whisper shapes itself around whatever I'm doing. It isn't angry, isn't threatening. It's patient. Like it's teaching me the name I'm supposed to answer to, one breath at a time. Sometimes I wake with the taste of iron on my tongue and the feeling that I've walked somewhere in the night, boots muddy, lungs full of mountain air. I check the solace in the morning. They're always clean, but the whisper knows better. It's still out there, circling, waiting for me to turn the right stone and step back into the ring. My cousin Ray and I grew up thick as thieves in a little holler outside of Harlan, Kentucky, where the creek ran orange half the year from old mine runoff, and the only thing louder than the cicadas in July was our mamas hollering us in for supper. By the time we hit our mid-20s, life had pulled us different directions. Ray stayed local, pouring concrete for the county, while I chased overtime at a distribution center 2 ridges over. We hadn't camped together since high school, but when Ray's divorce papers came through and my girlfriend moved out the same week, we figured the mountains owed us a reset. We picked a spot my granddaddy used to talk about, an old mica mine up near the Virginia line where the shafts were played out and the forest had swallowed the tipple whole. Locals called it the silent dig because sound just fell into it and never bounced back. We laughed at the name, loaded Ray's Ford with cheap beer and Vienna sausages, and set out on a Friday when the sky looked like it couldn't decide whether to rain or shine. Asterisk, the road in was more suggestion than pavement gravel giving way to dirt, then to twin ruts choked with sumac. We parked where the ruts ended and hiked the last mile with packs that got heavier with every switchback. The mine entrance was nothing dramatic, just a black notch in the hillside half hidden by laurel. But the air coming out of it carried a chill that didn't match the August heat. We skirted the opening and found a flat bench 50 yards downslope, a natural terrace ringed by hemlock and 1 lightning-scarred chestnut oak. The ground was carpeted with needles so thick our boots barely made a sound. Ray dropped his pack, stretched, and said it felt like walking on a church rug. I told him to quit blaspheming before the mountain heard him. We laughed, but the laugh didn't travel far. Asterisk, we set up quick 2 dome tents, a stone fire ring we built from creek rocks, and a cooler wedged between roots so the coons wouldn't get it. Dusk came purple and slow, the way it does when the ridges stack up like books on a shelf. We got the fire going with fatwood Ray shaved off a stump, and the flames threw gold up into the branches. We cracked beers, passed a bag of jerky, and let the talk roll the way it always had. Girls we never quite got over. Fights we won in memory but lost in real time. Lies about fish we'd caught in ponds too small to hold them. The mica mine loomed upslope, a darker patch against the dark, but the fire kept it at arm's length. Every so often, the breeze shifted and brought us that underground smell, cool, mineral, like licking a battery. Asterisk past midnight, the beer was gone and the fire had settled into a bed of coals that glowed like a dragon's heart. Ray was mid-sentence, something about his ex-wife's new boyfriend, when the words just dried up. Not because he forgot the punchline, but because the woods had gone still in a way that made your skin tighten. No frogs, no katydids, not even the rustle of a squirrel. Just the soft pop of a coal and our breathing. Ray looked at me, eyebrows raised. I shrugged, but the silence felt heavy, like someone had laid a quilt over the world. That's when I noticed the mud. Asterisk, it had rained 2 days earlier. A quick mountain gully washer, and the ground near the tree line was still dark and slick. In the firelight, I saw the first print heel deep, toes barely kissing the earth, coming out of the shadows like it had been placed there by hand. Then another, same angle, same deliberate weight. Ray saw them too. We stood slow, not wanting to spook whatever made them. The tracks circled our camp once, close enough that we could have reached out and touched a maker if he'd been there. Then they looped again, tighter, before angling straight into the woods, walking backward, heels digging furrows, toes dragging like an afterthought. Fresh mud glistened, still holding the shape. Ray grabbed the lantern, the old Coleman that hissed like a cat. I took the flashlight. We followed the trail because that's what you do when curiosity outweighs sense. The prints never wavered, never sped up. Just marched in reverse through the needles and laurel until the ground turned rocky and the mud gave out. 50 yards in, maybe 60, the track stopped. Not faded, not covered, stopped. The last heel print sat clean and final, no scuff, no pivot, no climb into the branches overhead. Just earth and the smell of wet stone. Ray swung the lantern in a slow arc. Nothing. I shone the flashlight up the trunks, half expecting to see eyes or a shape melting into the bark. The beam trembled, found only moss and spider silk. We stood there long enough for the lantern to paint our shadows on the trees like paper cutouts, asterisk on the hike back. The silence cracked open a little, crickets testing the air, a night bird giving one confused call. We told ourselves it was a prank, some local kid with too much time and a weird sense of humor. We even managed a laugh, but it sounded thin, like a radio losing signal. When we broke into the clearing, the fire was dead, coals smothered under a handful of dirt. Our tents stood open, doors unzipped and folded back neat as envelopes. The sleeping bags were out, laid side by side on the ground, rolled tight and tucked at the ends the way our mamas taught us for inspection. Ray's bag had a perfect hospital corner. Mine did too, except I never learned hospital corners in my life. Asterisk, I knelt, touched the fabric. Still warm. Inside my bag, centered on the footprint of where my chest would have been, lay a single flake of mica thin as a fingernail, edges sharp enough to slice. When I picked it up, a bead of blood welled instant and bright. Ray's bag was empty, but he went pale anyway. We didn't speak. We stuffed the bags any which way, kicked dirt over the fire ring, and left the cooler for the bears. The walkout took half the time it should have, our boots finding every root and rock in the dark. We didn't look back until the truck was between us and the mine. The ridge looked the same, laurel, hemlock, the scar of the old tipple, but the silence followed us down the switchbacks, riding the exhaust like a passenger. Asterisk, 3 days later, I was back in my apartment. Shower running to drown out the quiet when my phone buzzed. Ray's name on the screen. I answered expecting a joke, maybe a photo of the cooler mauled by coons. Instead, I got breathing, shallow and careful. Then his voice, barely above the water noise. "You still got that flake?" I told him I'd flushed it, lie tasting like copper. He made a sound like a laugh that forgot how. "Check under your tongue," he said and hung up. Asterisk, I did. Mirror, bathroom light harsh and yellow. I opened wide, lifted my tongue with a finger. There it was, same mica flake, wedged against the soft tissue underneath, edge already cutting a thin red line. I spat it into the sink. It rang against the porcelain like a coin. When I looked again, the cut was already closing, but the taste stayed iron and stone. Asterisk, Ray hasn't spoken above a whisper since. Doctors call it psychosomatic, blame stress, prescribe pills he doesn't take. I visit on Sundays, bring coffee he doesn't drink. We sit on his porch and watch the creek slide by, orange as ever. Sometimes he lifts his tongue, shows me the pale scar where the flake sat. It never reappears, but the shape is burned in like a brand. I still have the one from my sink. I keep it in a matchbox on the shelf above the stove. On quiet nights, I take it out, hold it to the light. It catches the bulb and throws tiny rainbows on the wall, prettiest sign. Then I hear the drag of toes across mud, the soft compression of heels walking backward into the dark, and I know the mine isn't done with us. It's just waiting for the next rain to soften the ground so the prints can find their way home. I was 31 the year I decided to walk the Laurel Hells alone. The kind of age where you start measuring life by what you haven't done yet instead of what you have. My wife had taken the dog and the good coffee maker 6 months earlier, and the apartment felt like a waiting room with rent due. I needed the mountains the way some men need a bar fight, something to remind me I could still feel my own pulse. Granddaddy's old kerosene lantern came with me, the one he swore kept the dark honest. He'd carried it through the Depression, through Korea, through nights when the coal dust got so thick you couldn't tell smoke from breath. "Fire don't lie," he'd say, trimming the wick with a pocket knife older than the state park system. "But darkness will." I filled it fresh at the hardware store in Boone, the clerk giving me the side-eye like I was buying dynamite. I told him it was for nostalgia. He didn't laugh. Asterisk, the trailhead sat off an unmarked Forest Service road, the kind you find by counting telephone poles and praying. I parked beside a rusted culvert, shouldered my pack, and started up the trace that locals call the Laurel Slick because the rhododendron grows so thick it turns the path into a tunnel. August heat pressed down, but the canopy kept the sun in pieces. Sweat soaked my shirt by the first mile, and the only sounds were my boots on damp earth and the occasional drip of condensation from leaves overhead. I hiked until the trace narrowed to a deer run, then cut cross-country following a compass bearing and the smell of water. Late afternoon found me a bench above a branch, a flat spot no bigger than a pickup bed, ringed by beech and hemlock. The ground was soft with decades of leaf mold, and a single lightning-split stump offered a place to hang the lantern. I pitched the tent, gathered deadfall, and had the kettle boiling before the ridgeline swallowed the light. Asterisk, night in the Laurel Hells is different from night anywhere else. The leaves hold the dark like water in a bowl, and sound travels sideways instead of out. I hung the lantern from a nub of branch on the stump, the flame steady and gold behind soot streaked glass. It threw a circle maybe 8 feet across, enough to cook by, enough to read the topo map if I wanted. I didn't. I ate chili straight from the can, the spoon scraping metal loud enough to make me wince. The kerosene smelled sharp and clean, cutting through the green rot of the woods. I banked the stove, checked the lantern wick, and crawled into the tent with the door cracked so the light could find me if I woke scared. Sleep came quick, the kind that drops you like a stone. Asterisk, I don't know what hour it was when my eyes snapped open. The tent was black, absolute, the way only deep woods can manage. No glow through the nylon, no ember-red coals from the stove. Just the smell of cold iron and the sense that something had shifted while I wasn't looking. I reached for the lantern gone. The stump outside was bare, the branch empty. I fumbled for my headlamp on the vestibule floor, dead. Batteries I'd tested that morning, now flat as roadkill. My pulse started its familiar climb, but I told myself calm. Animals, wind, maybe the hook had worked loose. I unzipped the door and stepped out barefoot, the leaf mold cool and slick under my soles. Asterisk, the clearing was wrong. The lantern light should have been there, a small sun against the dark, but the space felt hollowed out. I stood listening, every hair on my arms tuning to the silence. Then I saw a faint glow moving through the rhododendron, same height as mine, same gentle sway when I walked with the lantern in hand. It drifted left, then right, threading between trunks like it knew the way better than I did. I followed because that's what you do when the night takes something of yours. Thorns snatched at my calves, roots tried to trip me. But the light stayed just ahead, patient. Leading. Asterisk, the ground sloped down. Steeper than I remembered, and the air grew cooler, carrying that underground smell again. The glow stopped at the edge of something I hadn't seen on the way in a sinkhole, maybe 15 feet across, rimmed with moss and the pale roots of a toppled birch. The light hovered, then lowered itself slow, like a fisherman playing line into deep water. I crept to the edge, heart loud in my ears. 10 feet down, on a narrow ledge, sat the lantern. Flame steady, glass clean, wick trimmed perfect. The glow lit the walls of the hole in buttery detail, roots, clay, a trickle of water seeping from a crack. And there, in the globe's reflection, my face stared up. Asterisk, it wasn't my face. Not the one that had shaved that morning. Not the one with crow's feet starting and a scar through the left eyebrow from a high school fight. This face was smooth, unlined, eyes wide and calm. It smiled when I didn't. The expression stretched slow, like someone testing muscles they hadn't used in years. I felt my own mouth stay slack, felt the night air on my teeth. The reflection tilted its head, curious. I took one step back, then another, thorns forgotten. The lantern flame didn't flicker when I moved. It just watched. Asterisk, I ran. Not smart, not planned, ran blind through the brush, branches whipping my face, feet finding every sharp stone. The glow didn't follow, but the image burned behind my eyes. That smile, that calm. I crashed into the clearing at some point, lungs on fire, and dawn was already leaking gray through the leaves. My tent stood zipped and untouched. The stove sat cold. And there, on the stump, hung the lantern hooked exact, glass cool to the touch, reservoir bone dry. No fuel, no soot inside the globe, no warmth. I lifted it down with shaking hands. The weight was wrong, lighter than memory, like it had been emptied of more than kerosene. Asterisk, I broke camp in a daze, stuffing gear any which way. The lantern strapped to the outside of my pack because I couldn't stand it near my skin. The hike out took twice as long. Every root looked like a hand, every shadow a face waiting to smile. I reached the truck at noon, threw the pack in the bed, and sat behind the wheel until the engine heat baked the chill out of my bones. The lantern sat on the passenger seat, silent, ordinary. I drove with the windows down, radio loud enough to rattle the mirrors, but the smile kept pace in the corners of my vision. Asterisk, I gave the lantern away 3 weeks later to a church rummage sale. The lady who took it said it would look nice on a porch. I didn't tell her it had no fuel left to burn. Some nights I still wake tasting kerosene, feeling the cool glass under my palm. I checked the mirrors in the dark, half expecting to see that smooth face staring back, patient, waiting for me to hang the light again. The laurel slick is still there on the map, a green smear between contour lines. I drive past the turnoff sometimes, slow, like a man visiting a grave he dug himself. The woods don't call my name. They just smile, small and knowing, and wait for the next wick to trim. I was 28 when Sarah got the job offer in Charlotte. The kind of offer that comes with a signing bonus and a corner cubicle and the quiet. Promise that staying in the mountains would mean watching her dreams shrink to fit the county line. We'd been together since sophomore year at App State, trading late-night diner coffee for trail mix and tent stakes, and the idea of her leaving felt like losing a lung. So we planned one last trip, 3 nights in Deep Appalachia, no cell service, no schedule, just the two of us and the woods the way they used to be before interstates carved the ridges into postcards. We picked a spot my uncle marked on an old topo map, a bench above a dry creek bed where the hemlocks grew thick enough to muffle the world. Sarah packed the chili fixings, I packed the whisper stove, and we told ourselves it would be enough to say goodbye without saying it. Asterisk, the drive-in took us past abandoned orchards and mailboxes leaning like drunks, the pavement narrowing until it gave up and turned to gravel. We parked at a pull-off where the guardrail ended and the mountain began, shouldered our packs, and followed a deer trace that smelled of sap and iron. The creek bed below us was nothing but smooth stones and the ghost of water. The kind of place that only runs when the sky forgets how to hold itself together. We hiked until the sun sat low and gold between the trunks, then climbed a short pitch to the bench. The ground was level, carpeted with needles, and a single lightning-scarred oak offered low branches perfect for hammocks. Sarah laughed when she saw it, the sound bright against the green. We strung the hammocks first, then pitched the tent on the flat for gear, the nylon bright blue against the duff. I fired up the stove while she chopped onions, the hiss of propane and the sizzle of beef the only sounds for miles. Asterisk, dusk settled slow, the way it does when the ridges stack up like books on a shelf. We ate straight from the pot, passing it back and forth, steam fogging our glasses. Sarah talked about the new apartment, the balcony that caught sunrise, the way the city lights looked like scattered coals from the highway. I nodded in the right places, but the chili tasted like copper, and I kept hearing something in the trees, a soft shift, like fabric brushing bark. I told myself it was a squirrel, maybe a coon. We cleaned the pot with creek sand that wasn't there, banked the stove, and crawled into the hammocks with the tent zipped between us like a promise. The night smelled of pine and chili and the faint sweetness of Sarah's shampoo. Sleep came easy, the kind that wraps you in wool and rocks you gentle. Asterisk, I woke to cold. Not the slow chill of altitude, but a sudden drop, like someone opened a freezer door in July. My watch said 3:12, the numbers green and accusing. The hammock swayed, but there was no wind. Sarah breathed steady in the other sling, one arm dangling, fingers brushing the ground. Then I heard it, the breathing, deep, rhythmic, coming from inside the tent. Not human, not animal, just air moving in and out with purpose. I sat up slow, the hammock creaking loud enough to make me wince. The tent walls flexed, slow as lungs, nylon bowing in, then out, in, then out. The stakes held, but the fabric brushed the duff with each exhale. A soft hush like a giant throat clearing. Asterisk, I whispered Sarah's name. No answer. I eased out of the hammock, bare feet hitting cold earth, and crossed the few steps to her side. She was asleep, lips parted, hair stuck to her cheek with sweat that hadn't been there at midnight. I shook her shoulder gentle. Her eyes snapped open, wide and dark. "Listen," I said. We stood together, hammock cords cutting into our palms, and watched. The tent inhaled, the ridgeline sagging, then exhaled, the floor lifting a fraction before settling. Inhale, exhale, steady as a heartbeat. The sound was wet, almost like air through damp leaves. Sarah's hand found mine, fingers ice. "What is that?" She breathed. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Asterisk, we didn't speak again until the rhythm changed. The exhales grew longer, deeper, the nylon brushing the ground harder, stakes groaning in the soil. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, clicked it on. The beam cut clean through the dark, but showed nothing except the tent moving on its own. Sarah pulled me back to the hammocks, and we climbed in without letting go of each other. From there we had a clear view, the tent breathing, slow and patient, the blue fabric rippling like water. At one point, the door flap lifted, just an inch, then settled. No wind, no animal, just the breath. Asterisk, dawn came gray and reluctant, the kind of light that makes everything look bruised. The temperature climbed back to summer, but the chill stayed in our bones. The tent lay flat when the sun touched it, stakes pulled clean from the earth and laid side by side like silverware after supper. We approached slow, flashlight still in my hand, though the batteries were fresh again. The nylon was cool, ordinary. Inside, the sleeping pads were warm to the touch, indented with the shape of something wider than both of us shoulders. Hips, the suggestion of weight that had settled and risen through the night. The indentations were deep, the foam slow to rebound. Sarah knelt, touched one with 2 fingers. "It's still here," she said, voice small. I smelled it then, earth, and something muskier, like a den no one had opened in years. Asterisk, we didn't pack the tent. I poured the last of the stove fuel over it, struck a match, and watched the nylon curl and blacken. The smoke rose straight, no breeze to carry it, and the smell was chemical and wrong. Sarah burned the chili pot too, though it was clean. We left the hammocks hanging, cords cut with my knife, and hiked out with only what we wore and the packs on our backs. The creek bed was still dry, the stones still smooth, but the woods felt different, quieter, like they'd been holding their breath. Asterisk, Sarah moved to Charlotte 3 weeks later. She calls sometimes, leaves voicemails I don't answer. The messages are short. "I heard it again," or "the apartment breathes at night." I sleep with the windows open now, even in winter, because closed rooms feel too much like nylon walls. Some mornings I wake with the taste of pine in my mouth and the sense that something shifted while I wasn't looking. I check the floorboards for indentations, but they're always flat. The mountains keep their secrets, and the tent kept its breath. I still drive past the pull-off on my way to nowhere, slow, like a man visiting a grave he helped dig. The hemlocks don't move, but I swear the air is thicker there, waiting to be inhaled. I've always fished to keep the noise out of my head. No radio, no phone, just the hush of water and the small, honest tug of a bluegill deciding whether to bite. After my daddy passed heart gave out in the cab of his pickup while he waited on a parts delivery, I took to the mountains harder than before. The house in Clintwood felt too full of his cough and the smell of motor oil. So I'd load the rod, a canvas cot, and a cooler of bologna sandwiches into the truck and disappear for days. Folks in town quit asking where I went. They just nodded when I came back sunburned and quiet. That September, I headed for a beaver pond the old-timers call Mirror Lake, tucked so deep in the Jefferson forest that the topo maps barely admit it exists. They say the water never ripples, not even when the wind combs the ridges. I figured that suited me fine. Asterisk. The road in was a pair of ruts that hadn't seen a vehicle since the Clinton administration. I parked at the blockade of fallen birch, shouldered my pack, and followed the game trail that smelled of wet moss and bear scat. The hike took most of the afternoon, boots sinking into duff-thick as carpet. When I broke through the laurel, the pond lay in front of me like a coin dropped on green felt round, still and dark enough to swallow the sky. Alders crowded the far bank, and a single dead hemlock leaned over the water, roots exposed like knuckles. I set up on the near side where the ground rose a little, just enough to keep my feet dry if the beavers ever decided to raise the level. The cot went under the hemlock's shadow, the rod racked beside it. I baited with a piece of hot dog wiener and made my first cast as the sun bled out behind the ridge. Asterisk. The plop of the sinker was the loudest sound I'd heard all day. The bobber sat red and perfect, a period at the end of a long sentence. I settled onto the camp stool with a warm beer and waited for the tug that never hurried. Dusk came quick, the way it does when the mountains shoulder the light away. Crickets started, then tree frogs, then nothing. The pond stayed glass. That's when the singing began. Asterisk, it wasn't loud, just a thread of melody drifting across the water, minor key. The kind of hymn you hear at Brush Arbor revivals when the preacher's voice cracks and the women fan themselves with funeral home fans. The voice was low, rough, like a woman who'd smoked unfiltered Camels since she was 12. I knew every word. Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. No houses for 20 miles, no trails, no reason for a soul to be within earshot. I reeled in slow, the line whispering through the guides. The bobber came back clean, no nibble, no weed. The singing kept on, verse after verse, moving from the far bank to my left, then behind me, then closer, until the final note settled under the cot like a cat curling up to die. Asterisk, I didn't sleep. I sat with the rod across my knees, flashlight in my fist, listening to the night hold its breath. The melody looped, softer each time, until it was only breath shaped like music. At some point, the frogs started again, tentative, like they were asking permission. I must have dozed upright, because the next thing I knew, the sky was the color of wheat coffee and the pond still hadn't rippled. My line was gone. Not cut, not tangled gone. The rod tip pointed at empty water, the reel spool naked. The red bobber floated alone in the middle of the lake, too far to reach without waiting. I stood, joints popping, and that's when I saw the mud dot asterisk. The bank was soft where the beavers had chewed the alders, black and slick. Written there with my own hook still attached to the leader, the hot dog bait dried to a nub, were words in the mud. Letters perfect, 2 inches high, running from the water's edge to the toe of my boot print. Cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine. The next verse of the hymn. Except the letters were backward, mirror writing, as if the hook had been dragged by someone facing away from the pond. I stared long enough for the sun to burn the chill off the air. Then I took the film camera from my pack reel film, the kind my daddy taught me to load in the dark, and snapped 3 shots before the mud could dry and crack. Asterisk, I broke camp fast. Cot folded, rod broken down, cooler left for the coons. The bobber still floated in the middle of the lake, red as a warning. I hiked out with the hook in my pocket, the barb wrapped in electrical tape so it wouldn't snag. The trail felt longer going out, every root a question, every shadow a throat clearing. I reached the truck by noon, hands shaking too hard to unlock the door on the first try. I drove with the windows down, radio off. The hymn stuck behind my eyes like a burr. Asterisk. 3 days later, I stood in the darkroom I'd built in the garage. Red bulb humming, trays of developer smelling of vinegar and regret. I agitated the tank slow, counting seconds the way Daddy showed me. When I lifted the negative to the light, the letters were there clear, sharp, no longer backward. They spelled my name, James Riley Cockerham. Middle included. The one on my birth certificate. The one nobody's used since the day I was born, because Mama said it sounded like a lawyer, not a fisherman. I printed the photo on fiber paper, watched the image bloom under the safe light. The mud was smooth, the hook a dark slash, the letters perfect. I hung the print to dry and stared until the chemicals burned my eyes. Asterisk, I went back to Mirror Lake the next spring. Earlier in the season, ice still rimming the alders. The pond was the same round, dark, still. My boot prints from the year before were gone, washed away by snowmelt or beavers or something that walks on 2 legs and doesn't leave tracks. I cast a new line, same hot dog bait, same red bobber. It floated for an hour, maybe 2. Then the singing started again, closer this time, coming from under the cot I hadn't set up yet. I reeled in. The hook was gone. In its place, knotted to the leader, was a single strand of gray hair, coarse, smelling of wood smoke and camphor. I cut it free with my knife and let it drift on the water. The pond took it without a ripple. Asterisk, I don't fish Mirror Lake anymore. I keep the print in a cigar box under the bed, the one with Daddy's war medals and Mama's funeral program. Some nights the hymn wakes me, soft as breath, under the floorboards. I lie still and listen until the last note fades. Then check the mirror to make sure the letters haven't moved from the photo to my skin. They haven't, not yet. But the bobber still floats out there, red and patient, waiting for the next cast to spell whatever comes after my name. I was 35 when I took that solo trip. The kind of age where the years start to feel like gravel and your boots heavy, but you keep walking anyway. My marriage had ended quiet, no slammed doors. Just a note on the kitchen table saying she needed city air and I needed something I couldn't name. The house in Abingdon sat too still after she left, the clock ticking loud enough to wake me at night. So I loaded the truck with a wall tent, a cooler of deer steaks, and the bow saw my granddaddy used to clear trails before the Park Service took over. Late October, the leaves were down, but the smell of them hung thick sweet rot and wet earth, the scent of endings. I headed for a ridge above the Clinch River where the tulip poplars grow straight and tall. The kind of trees that make you feel small in a way that's almost holy. Asterisk, the Forest Service road was gated. chain rusted through, so I parked and walked the last 3 miles with the pack cutting into my shoulders. The ridge narrowed to a spine, hemlocks on one side, a drop-off on the other thick with rhododendron. I found a bench maybe 20 yards wide, a natural shelf where the wind had scoured the duff clean. One tulip poplar stood apart from the rest, trunk smooth and pale, maybe 3 feet through. I set the tent facing it, the door flap open so I could watch the bark catch the last light. Supper was steak seared over a small fire, coffee black enough to float a horseshoe. The knife I used was Daddy's old case, carbon steel gone dark with age, handle worn smooth by his palm and now mine. I cleaned it on my jeans after eating, the blade catching the firelight like it remembered blood. Asterisk night drops fast in late October. 1 minute the sky's a bruised peach, the next its ink poured over everything. I banked the fire, crawled into the tent, and listened to the wind pick up. Branches clacked overhead, dry bones in a sack. Sleep came in pieces, the kind where you surface every hour convinced something's moved. Around 3, maybe 4, the scratching started. Soft at first, like a squirrel testing bark, then deliberate, rhythmic, right at the poplar's trunk. I sat up, heart already climbing. The sound paused, then resumed scrape, pause, scrape like fingernails worrying a scab. I grabbed the flashlight, unzipped the door slow. The beam cut clean through the dark and found the tree. Asterisk, the knife was there, driven dead center into my initial shallow letters I'd carved that afternoon. Nothing deep, just enough to mark the year. The blade was buried to the hilt, handle wrapped in fresh bark that hadn't been there at sunset. Pale curls of wood hugged the bone scales tight, and sap bled slow over the steel, thick as syrup in the cold. I stood barefoot in the needles, breath fogging, and watched the tree hold what was mine. The scratching had stopped, but the trunk seemed to pulse, a slow flex like a throat swallowing. I reached out, fingers numb, and gripped the handle. The bark tightened. Wood groaned low, the sound of a house settling in on itself. I pulled. The knife didn't budge. Sap oozed warmer now, coating my palm, smelling of green walnuts and iron. Asterisk, I tried again, heels dug into the duff, shoulder against the trunk. The poplar answered with a creak that traveled up the ridge, branches shivering though the wind had died. My hand slipped, bark tearing skin, and the tree took the knife deeper, steel disappearing until only the butt of the handle showed. I backed away, chest heaving, and the night went still. No crickets, no owls, just the smell of sap and my own blood mixing on the air. I left the knife where it was. Some things you don't fight with bare hands. Asterisk dawn came gray and thin, frost feathering the tent. The poplar stood quiet, the carving sealed over with a ridge of fresh wood, the knife gone entirely. Sap had crusted dark, a scab over the wound. I broke camp fast, hands shaking while I rolled the tent. The bow saw clattering against the cooler. I hiked out without looking back until the ridge forced me to turn. The tree was just a pale trunk among others, but I felt its attention on my neck the whole way down that asterisk, 2 years past. I hunted that ridge every October, telling myself it was for deer, not answers. The marriage scar had healed to a thin line. I'd even started dating a nurse from Bristol who laughed at my stories, but not at me. The poplar stayed in my head though, a splinter I couldn't dig out. Then came the storm late-season thunder that rolled through the Clinch Valley like artillery. Lightning struck the ridge twice, close enough to smell ozone. I went back the following week, bow across my back, telling the nurse I needed to check a stand. Asterisk, the tree was split clean, heartwood pale and steaming where the bolt had entered. The trunk lay open like a book, pages of annual rings telling a story I couldn't read. And there, in the center, lay the knife. Blade rusted to lace, handle polished smooth as river stone. The bone scales were worn translucent, grooves deep where fingers, human fingers, I swear had worried it every night since I walked away. Sap had crystallized around the tang, amber and perfect. I knelt in the sawdust, breath shallow, and lifted the knife. It was warm. Not sun warm, but body warm, like it had been carried close to skin. Asterisk, I wrapped it in oilcloth and took it home. The nurse left when I wouldn't throw it away. I keep it now in a cedar box on the mantel, the one Daddy built for Mama's Bible. Some nights the wind finds the chimney just right and the house fills with the smell of green walnuts. I wake to scratching soft, deliberate, like fingernails on bark. The knife is always where I left it, but the handle is smoother each morning, the rust flaking away in perfect curls. I don't hunt that ridge anymore. I don't need to. The poplar sent its message, and the message is still growing, one ring at a time, until the wood remembers my name better than I do. I was 42 the fall I decided to walk the game trails until the mountains forgot my name. The mill in Damascus had closed for good, the layoff notice polite as a funeral card, and the house felt like a shirt I'd outgrown tight across the shoulders, empty in the sleeves. My boys were grown, one in the army, the other chasing carpentry work in Nashville, and my wife had taken to sleeping in the spare room with the TV on low. I told her I needed a week to clear the sawdust from my lungs. She nodded without looking up from her crossword. I packed light, canvas tarp, wool blanket, a tin cup, and the kind of silence that follows a man who's said too much and not enough. Asterisk, I left the truck at the trailhead before dawn, the gravel still holding frost. The path I followed wasn't on any map, just a crease in the laurel where deer and bear had worn the earth smooth. I walked until the sun was a rumor behind the ridges, boots finding purchase on moss and root. The air smelled of leaf mold and the faint iron of coming snow. Late afternoon, I broke through a wall of rhododendron and stepped into a meadow I'd never seen, though I'd hunted these slopes since I could carry a vey. 22. Knee-high grass swayed pale gold, ringed by hemlocks so dark it looked wet. In the center sat a single boulder, gray and rounded, big enough to sit two men shoulder to shoulder. The clearing felt deliberate, like a room someone had swept clean and left waiting. Asterisk, I walked the perimeter slow, counting paces. 30 yards across, maybe 35. No stumps, no briars, no sign anything had ever been cut or burned. The grass bent under my boots but sprang back without breaking. I set the tarp between two hemlocks, rolled the blanket for a pillow, and built a small fire against the boulder. Supper was jerky and hardtack washed down with creek water that tasted of stone. The sky went from copper to indigo without stopping at dusk. I lay back with my hands behind my head and watched the stars come out one by one, sharp as tack holes in black cloth. Sleep took me hard, the kind that erases the day. Asterisk, I woke to fog thick as wool and the smell of wet ash. The fire was out, coals buried under gray dust, though I'd banked it careful. My watch said 5:47, but the light was wrong, neither dawn nor dark, just a flat, directionless gray. I sat up inside the tarp and the meadow was gone. Same hemlocks, same boulder, but the ground under me was pine needles and duff, thick and springy, no trace of grass. The tarp lay on forest floor that hadn't been there the night before. I stood slow, joints popping, and walked the space where the clearing had been. 30 paces in any direction brought me to trunks and laurel, the boulder still in the center, but now ringed by needles. My boot prints from the evening were there deep, clear, leading from the rhododendron wall to the spot where I'd slept. But they stopped at the tarp. No prints led out. Asterisk, the stove sat on the boulder, cold, the tin cup beside it. I'd left both by the fire. Around the rock, pressed flat into the duff, were the blades of grass I'd trampled the night before golden. Unbroken, braided into a neat circle maybe 3 feet across. The weave was tight, 3-strand, the kind my mama used for onion sacks. I knelt and touched it. The grass was cool, damp, alive. I lifted the braid free. The ends didn't fray, just tapered clean as if cut with a blade. I tucked it into my shirt pocket without thinking. Asterisk, I followed my boot prints back the way I'd come. They entered the fog at the rhododendron wall, heel, toe, then vanished. Not faded, not covered, vanished. The ground beyond was undisturbed, needles raked smooth as if no one had passed in years. I stood there long enough for the fog to soak my coat, listening for birds, for wind, for anything. Nothing answered. I turned back to the boulder. The stove and cup were where I'd left them, but the braid was warm against my chest, pulsing faint like a second heart. Asterisk, I broke camp in a daze, rolling the tarp with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The braid went into the side pocket of my pack, wrapped in a bandana. I walked out along the game trail, counting steps to keep the panic down. The fog thinned. As I descended, giving way to hardwoods and the smell of wood smoke from some distant cabin. I reached the truck by noon, the sun high and indifferent. The clearing stayed in my head the whole drive home, gold grass, gray rock, the braid breathing against my ribs. Asterisk, I keep it still, in a Prince Albert tin on the shelf above the wood stove. It never wilts, never browns, the gold gone pale but unbroken. Some nights I take it out and hold it to my ear. There's wind inside, soft, steady, moving through grass that isn't there. If I listen long enough, I hear footsteps heavy, deliberate, walking a circle that ends where it begins. I don't go back to that ridge. I don't need to. The clearing comes to me now, in the creak of the floorboards, in the hush before snow. And every October, the braid grows a fraction longer, one blade at a time, weaving itself into something I'll have to step into when the circle's finally wide enough to hold me.